Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Atomic Museum today. I'm Matt Malinowski. I'm the Director of Education here at the museum, and this is our speaker series called Stories from the Atomic Age. And today, we're just delighted to have Robert Friedrichs with us again to give us a presentation about Johnston Atoll today. Before I pass it over to Robert, just a couple other things to kind of put on your radar that's going on at the museum here. Monthly, we have our STEM Saturday events. So we've got one of those coming up on April 6th. That's free for students to come in, do some hands-on activities with our partners at Nevada National Security Sites. We also will be having another Atomics event, which is really fun, where we go out into the community to a theater or to somewhere kind of fun, a different type of venue, and have a presentation there as well. So the next one of those will kind of come up in the next week or two. The announcement should. And we've got May the Science Be With You on May 2nd here. It's our Star Wars themed day in partnership with the Desert Research Institute that we have here as well. So we talk about things that are atomic and connect that back to the fun of Star Wars as well. So Robert Friedrichs has more than 30 years of experience working in and around nuclear. He served as manager for top secret and high-level programs from Johnston Atoll to the Nevada test site. Robert is set to unravel the mysteries behind Johnston Atoll for us and give us an overall history of the place, which is very unique and very different. So, Robert, we're all set for you. Please welcome Robert Friedrichs, everyone. Thank you.
Afternoon. I'm glad you guys could make it. I hope you'll enjoy this talk. It's a history of a unique location in the Pacific that I knew nothing about as a kid, and as an adult thought I had gone to the playground. It was really, really a remarkable experience to be there, work with such fine people as this gentleman here in the front, who was my companion in crime at one point, and it's just really a subject I feel very strong about. I really enjoy it. Okay. Starting with the first people who were fortunate enough to find Johnston Atoll. Those were the Polynesians, some point between 400 and 500 AD. They used the trade winds, followed seabirds, and came across a very shallow atoll. It had two islands. One would become known as Johnston Island, the other Sand Island. And both have been added to, and then two more have been built in more recent times. They never permanently occupied the islands of the atoll because there was no fresh water. There was just whatever rainwater they could catch as they were going along. And it had limited vegetation. When you look at pictures of it today, it has a fairly lush vegetation growing on Johnston in particular, but the other three islands also. And it also had a problem with high tides, hurricanes, etc. So it just wasn't really practical. In January 1625, the Dutch Nassau fleet documented the approximate location of Johnston Atoll, but because of fairly primitive navigational tools, they did not get a real accurate designation for it. Then in December 1809, Captain Charles James Johnstone, the captain of the HMS Cornwallis, documented the exact location. And he called it the Cornwallis Islands. Later on, the name was changed to honor the ship's captain to Johnston, but they misspelled it. So that's not a very nice honor, I don't think. The next real big thing, that happened pertaining to Johnston Atoll was on August 18th, 1856. Congress passed the Guanos Act, and that was in retaliation to the high costs of fertilizer, primarily guano fertilizer that was coming from the west coast of South America. The people harvesting it would then have to provide it to the government. They would control the cost for sale to other countries. And so the Midwest farmers in particular was subjected to the whims of whatever government was in control of the country at any given time. The interesting thing about the Guanos Act, it said any American could take possession of any island, rock, or key that was not already, with guano on it, that was not already claimed by another country. However, it also required that the individuals taking possession had to have a permanent presence on the island. On March 9th, 1858, William H. Parker visited the islands in the schooner Palestine, and they put up a flagstaff with a cross on the top on Sand Island and an American flag, thus claiming it for America. He named Sand Island Agnes Island after his daughter, but later on that name was dropped and it returned to being Sand Island. He took away 1,200 pounds of guano and sailed to San Francisco with it. That must have been a real pleasant ship ride. On June 19th, 1926, President Calvin Coolidge signed an executive order that made Johnston Island, Sand Island, and Sand Island to be reserved, permanently set apart, and turned over to the Department of Agriculture as a refuge and breeding ground for the birds. That was to be known as Johnston Island Reservation. So that's what Johnston Island Reservation looked like. Not much when you see the overheads today. December 29th, 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt placed Wake Island, Kingman Reef, Johnston, and Sand Island under control of the Secretary of Navy for administrative purposes. So the Department of Agriculture were out the door. April 1939, Congress appropriated funding for construction of a warplane, minecraft, and submarine base on Johnston Atoll. Fall 1939, construction began on Sand Island for that Naval Air Station. This is what it looked like at that point. Not very big yet. Later on, they also expanded construction to Johnston Atoll, Island because they needed a runway capable of handling bombers. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese submarine I-22 with a midget submarine number 15 on board was launched outside of Pearl Harbor. The miniature submarine made it into the harbor. They successfully fired 2 torpedoes without damaging any ships. And at 8:30 that morning, the USS Monaghan rammed it and sunk it. The I-22 then went to a staging area near Kauai with other submarines to pick up the miniature sub crews. None made it there. So they in turn then went to Johnston Atoll, and on December 12th, one of the submarines surfaced 8,000 yards offshore and fired several star shells so they could see what was on the island, its approximate positions and that. Then on the 21st, Japanese submarines returned, fired star shells over Sand Island again, and then on the 22nd, a Japanese submarine fired on Sand Island and took out the radio tower. On the 27th, a Japanese sub returned and was hit by a marine fire and sank in 70 feet of water. I've looked at overhead images and I can't see where it sunk, but when you look at the reef, it drops off really fast. So it may have sunk in 70 feet, but then over the years tumbled further down. Okay. After during World War II and afterwards, the submarines used Johnston Atoll for refueling of their submarines, and by 1944, the atoll was one of the busiest air transport terminals in the Pacific. They tell a story about an individual who was towing a cargo aircraft that had just landed to an area where it could be parked. The driver turned around to make sure the pilots were observant and that everybody was ready to be put into position. And as he was still turned around looking at the cockpit crew, he ran into the ocean. That's how small that island was. On July 1st, 1948, the operational control of the islands were turned over to the U.S. Air Force. They in turn renamed the facility Johnston Island Air Force Base. In the 1950s, they, because of Korea, had Johnston Island as one of the busiest airfields in the Pacific, handling shipments, flights, what have you, into Korea. They at that point allowed families to be on the island. And the base commander put up a $100 prize for the first, and I'm not sure why they were saying what they did, however, the first married family to have a child on the island. The records don't explain if someone tried to get it who wasn't married or if anyone got it and who that might be. In 1958, they again did dredge and fill operations and increased the size of Johnston Island to 185 acres in size. So you can see it's still tiny. 1958, the Department of Defense initiated a study of the effects of high-altitude detonations of nuclear weapons called Operation Hardtack 1. Two of the tests in that series were held on Johnston Atoll. The interesting thing is, the person that was there observing the launch of the rockets that put these two weapons in space or packages in space and were detonated was Werner von Braun. So the island, and there are more that will follow, very interesting for such a small little place in the middle of nowhere to have individuals like that who were there working. There were two tests. They both used Redstone rockets, and that's why von Braun was there, because he was intimately familiar with that, since that's the first rocket that was developed for the U.S. after he was brought to the U.S. at the end of World War II. The first test is Operation Teak on August 1st, 58. And that's the one on the top left. After launch, it veered off course and had to be detonated at an altitude of 252,000 feet. The next test, shown on the bottom right, August 12th, Orange. It was detonated at an altitude of 141,000 feet. Neither one of these have a yield announced with them. October 31st, President Eisenhower announced a unilateral atomic testing moratorium. (1962) is a whole different picture. As part of Operation Operation Dominic, a subset of tests called Operation Fishbowl were tested on Johnston Atoll using airdrops and Thor rocket launches. And I'll have to read this part because this is what they were testing to determine. First, the capability of an anti-ballistic missile to operate in a nuclear environment. Second, vulnerability of U.S. re-entry vehicles to survive a nearby nuclear test. 3, the ability of U.S. radar systems to detect and track re-entry vehicles. 4, to discern the effects of a high-altitude blast on command and control systems. And boy, did they ever learn that one. The last, and to obtain information on the feasibility of testing in outer space. That is the rocket launch pad that they fired the Thor rockets from. We'll go over successful tests first. July 9th, 1962, Starfish Prime, using a Thor rocket, reached an altitude of 250 miles, was detonated and produced a yield of 1.4 megatons. This explosion caused an artificial aurora that was seen from Alaska to Antarctica. It tripped burglar alarms because of the electromagnetic pulse that it created. Burglar alarms in Honolulu. It had a complete communications blackout across the Pacific. Communications weren't reestablished for 4 or 5 hours. When they finally called Washington and said, "We're still here." Second, and it's Androscoggin. I do not have a photo of that. It detonated at 10,200 feet and had a 75 kiloton yield. Then on October 6th, there was an airdrop, and that was detonated at 9,900 feet and produced an 11.3 kiloton yield. October 18th, Chama, I do not have a photograph of that, was another airdrop that was detonated at 11,970 feet. It had a yield of 1.59 megatons. October 20th, they had a Thor rocket launch. The name of that test was Checkmate. It reached an altitude of tens of miles with a low yield. But it's considered a successful test, so I'm not sure what they were testing. Then on October 26th, Bluegill Prime was another Thor rocket that was tested. It reached tens of miles and had a sub-megaton yield. October 27th, 1962, test Calamity, which was an airdrop, was detonated at 4,254 feet. It had a yield of 800 kilotons. We've got somebody in the front row very familiar with weapon yields, and he's up here moaning. These were the big boys. October 30th, Housatonic, and that's Housatonic there, was an airdrop detonated 12,130 feet, and it had a yield of 8.3 megatons. November 4th, a tightrope, a rocket launch reached tens of miles with a low yield. Okay, the non-nuclear yield tests, they did not reach altitude. There were problems with the launches, et cetera. So they were not, the warhead was not detonated, and the missile would be exploded because it was unstable. They couldn't control it anymore. June 3rd, 1962, Bluegill had a warhead on it, but 5 minutes into the flight, the missile tracking system failed. So the range safety officer had to hit the destruct button. June 19th, Starfish launched. 59 seconds after the launch, the rocket engine cut out and the range safety officer hit the destruct button. July 25th, Bluegill Prime, immediately after ignition, the rocket engine malfunctioned and the radiation safety officer hit the destruct button while the missile was still on the pad. That's what you see in the top left. That's at the moment he hit the destruct button. That created quite a mess, as one might imagine. There was plutonium spread everywhere in the general area. And so they had to go into a rather sophisticated set of procedures that I'll get into later. October 15th, Bluegill Double Prime. 90 seconds into the flight, the missile began to tumble. So the range safety officer detonated that. August 5th, 1963, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union entered into what was referred to as the Limited Test Ban Treaty. That banned nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in space, and under the ocean. There were a series of safeguards that Congress required of the president in order to approve the treaty. And they were referred to as the safeguards. One of the safeguards, Safeguard C, required that the Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission be able to resume atmospheric testing in a very, very short time if the need were to arise. Okay, the activities during the 60s, after that, 64, they had expansion through dredge and fill to create Johnston Island with a total of 625 acres. And they created North and East Islands. Those were used for various tracking and other purposes, and other users would come in for that location. Tracking spacecraft, all kinds of things went on. 60s, they dumped a lot of money in to rehabilitate the entire infrastructure. 1960s, Vietnam. Johnston Atoll was a critical waypoint on the movement of traffic to and from Southeast Asia. They needed that extra square footage just because of the tremendous number of aircraft they had going through. In May 17th, 1968, the Department of Defense did a study about the hazards of civilians on Johnston Island. And up to that point, there was a prohibition of civilians being able to land there on commercial flights. The result of that study was there was virtually no risk to a transient flight and the people on it. So therefore, the Department of Defense granted the Civil Aeronautics Board authorization to start commercial flights in there, or through there. Air Micronesia was the first flight to go in. And that's the aircraft carrier that I flew on when I went in there the first time. Several years later. It was really interesting because at that time, the cabin was cut in half. They used the front half for cargo and then the belly for cargo to include chickens. So, July 1969, President Richard Nixon landed on the island, spent the night there in the commander's bungalow. And when I was last there, they still had a plaque on the wall that Richard Nixon had slept there. He was on his way to a Navy aircraft carrier supporting the recovery of the returning Apollo 11 flight crew. Operation Red Hat, that began April 1972 when 1.37 million gallons of defoliant Agent Orange was moved from Vietnam to Johnston Island for storage. If you look at the barrels, in this next slide, that was the condition they came in. Many had to be overpacked because they were so rusted and leaking. It was a disaster, but they were able to get control over it. They had a specially built ship called the Vulcanus that had an incinerator capability on it. They incinerated all of the Agent Orange material that they had picked up at Johnston and then went to a remote Pacific location. Exact location unknown. And when they finished the incineration, they could then dump the debris, which was clean, over the side. September 12th, 1977, they finally completed all of the incineration. In 1976, Congress and the President reached an agreement that they would redefine Safeguard C to remove the requirement for a return to atmospheric testing within a specified time period. The island was placed into a caretaker status, and significantly reduced the number of civilian and military personnel on the island. The one thing that they did was have an agreement between the Department of Energy and the Defense Nuclear Agency to have a comprehensive management plan for the island. And that then allowed them to begin refurbishing buildings, building new facilities, and by the 80s, it was a pretty nice vacation. Doug's not agreeing with me. Say no, your wife's here, no. But it was just wonderful. The next slide. I talked about the plutonium cleanup before. From 62 through 1979, immediately after that Thor rocket explosion, they had extensive surveys of the islands, or Johnston Island, multiple times, using different types of equipment, locating contaminated areas, marking it. By the time I got there in the late 1980s, they had one person, radiation safety monitor, who in his spare time went around with a little cart with a probe on the front of it, and anytime he got any kind of a signal, he would then scrape the coral sand down, and find the little black spot of material. And then he would put that in a bucket, and he would take the results of his day back and keep it in a less than critical mass, and then would properly dispose of it when they had enough to make it necessary to get it off island. In 1993, though, they developed a plutonium separator system. This was really interesting because it would take material, and as it came down the chute, it had a probe, and if it spotted anything, it would switch that section over, that would dump just that section and then back to go into the clean fill. They also tried to do tests of coral cleanup at the test site. In most cases, the particles were so minute, it was really difficult. And so a lot of the material was sent to the test site and buried in the contaminated landfill out there. JCAD's facility. Almost missed a key thing here. This is what it was later best known for. When Okinawa and other locations were turned back to the Japanese, there were a lot of chemical weapons that had been stored on those islands. And as part of the agreement, the United States had to remove that material before the Japanese government could take full possession. So guess where that went? Johnston Atoll. They created a facility in 1985 called the Johnston Atoll Chemical Agent Disposal System Facility. So they just always called it JCADS. They began construction in 1985, and in 1990, prior to the Pacific Island Nations-United States Summit in Honolulu, Hawaii, President George H.W. Bush visited the island to get familiarized with the JCADS facility, the weapons stored there, and had a heck of a good evening, as you can see. November 1993, congressional funding for Safeguard C was completely eliminated. The mission of Johnston Atoll was redefined for the storage and destruction of chemical weapons. November 29th, 2000, the last of 400,000 obsolete chemical weapons were destroyed. Also destroyed at JCADS were over 2,000 tons of nerve agents, sarin and VX, as well as the blister agent HD. The Army finished the cleanup of the facility and demolishing of it in December 2003. And that's the picture on the top left as they're tearing it down. As part of the cleanup, the Army had to send in samples for EPA analyses to ensure that everything had been remediated properly. Unfortunately, they found a section of coral that had contaminated material in it. So they had to come back. Well, the base was all gone. How were they going to come back and do that? The company in Washington State chartered a crab boat and pulled a barge down there with their heavy equipment in it. They lived on the crab boat, they ate on the crab boat, and they dug the hole. And then when they finished, they had all of the material in giant bags that they put into the barge and put the equipment back on top of the bags and sailed back to Washington State. So I had a picture at one point, and then I don't know what happened to it. I've called the company and talked to the guy who was the head of the operation on that cleanup. He said he didn't have a copy of it either. But it was really interesting to see the pier, and here's this crab boat, and there are like a half dozen guys out there standing there for their picture. As I mentioned, with the JCADS being torn down, they literally tore down the entire infrastructure of the base. They did not remove the runway. They just put giant yellow crosses on it, and anyone fool enough to try to land on it now is really going to be in trouble because it's got weeds growing everywhere. So, once that final cleanup was done and the EPA signed off, the island was turned back over to the Fish and Wildlife Service as originally intended under the Executive Order of 1926. And that's a nice last shot as they were pulling out. This is Johnston Atoll National Wildlife Refuge in 2019. So you can see approximately 16 years later, you can see the vegetation already growing in. I've got some photos up here. You can see before and after of some of the locations on the island and how the vegetation has really made a remarkable spurt. After all the damage that was done with the various construction phases and everything and destroying the seabird populations, that has sprung back beautifully. They have had a couple of problems. When we were there, termites were an issue. In fact, I think it was Doug's bed. We walked in one day and bumped it, and the headboard fell down. The termites had eaten the wood out. So after we left, they had the fire ants, and so they had a tremendous fight with Fish and Wildlife over trying to destroy the colonies of fire ants because they didn't want any poisons used on the island. Raytheon Services, one of their scientists came up with an approach that Fish and Wildlife finally approved. They had the entire island set up into 4 zones, and they picked the most populated building and would take them out there, and then the next most populated. So at any time, they just had 4 little spots on the island that was being treated. And they brought dogs in that could sniff out the ant burrows and then dig them up, and they could spray them directly. Last study they had, they reported 1 ant on the entire island that they were able to find. So I always thought that was interesting. Johnston Atoll itself is part of the Johnston Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, which is part of the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. It includes the shallow coral reef that encompasses approximately 32,000 acres. And the boundary is 200-mile radius around Johnston Atoll. Because of the unique remoteness and importance of that island and the role it plays with seagoing bird populations, it is not open to the public, and entry is only allowed through a special use permit when the activity is deemed appropriate with purposes to the refuge establishment. However, I've gone online, I've seen photographs that were taken from the tallest building on the island well after it was closed. Individuals are still going there in their boats, tying up at the wharf, going in, looking around. They don't understand their very presence may be reintroducing the fire ants or termites or other pests that the sea life, the bird life cannot tolerate. So it's really important that people understand the impact they can have on a very, very delicate infrastructure and wildlife. That's all I've got. I've got various items up here that you might be interested in looking at, and I can explain any of them. Do you have any questions? I'll start with someone I've known a long time. Not quite as long as you, Roger, but.
Plutonium is gone or still there, temporary storage?
If you read the various reports, some of it was buried on the island, the early stuff. Some of it was dumped in the ocean. Most of it was collected and removed. But I will not say it's not still, some still there.
The surrounding areas of the atoll, do they still periodically monitor it?
Fish and Wildlife will have people on the island from time to time. That's how I got the pictures, the after pictures up here. So those were taken by Fish and Wildlife personnel. But there is no permanent presence on the atoll.
What about the waters surrounding
No. It's so remote. They go in maybe once a year, do bird counts and things like that, and then they're off again. Roger.
How far away from the atoll would it test?
Good question. Obviously, one was right on the pad. They were all extremely high altitude and downrange. So the bombers, obviously, their drops and that, in addition to the missiles going really high and really far. So.
I'd just like to let everybody know that I spent 7 years on Johnston Atoll. And the chemical weapons disposal. The reclamation area you're talking about is across the street where I live.
So you were in one of the barracks? Yep.
There was no air conditioning at the time. There were 4 stories. They had one simple shower and toilet down the building. And the windows were all louvered glass. Which I noticed on the picture still, the barracks show.
Well,
There's one building left there now, which is
The-
the VOC.
right, the 4-story one.
Right, yeah. That's the only one that's left. I went there, I arrived there May 25th of 1989. And I left there in 1995.
Well, I can't relate to the problem with the shower down the hall because we had a 2-bedroom apartment.
Our bedroom, we finally got some air conditioned quarters, they were called the red ones. They were, they came from Airspace, Colorado, with a, left out on the barge. They were built for the, oil spill in Alaska.
Mhm.
The rooms were 8 feet wide and 10 feet long. You had a bed, you had your own toilet, and a sink, and chest of drawers, and a place for your TV, so you barely had room to get past all that, to even sleep in there. But they were
The-
air conditioned.
The first time I went over, we had some other safety and health people that came after me. And one of them was an industrial hygienist. And he didn't understand that there was a big glass jar in the room. Did you have one of those?
No,
Well, the guest quarters had those. And he didn't understand what that was for. And so at the cafeteria, he got a couple of donuts. And in the middle of the night, he got hungry. So he reached over and he took a powdered donut and took a mouthful. And it was covered with the tiny little ants. And that's what the bottle was for. So he had a mouthful of ants.
As you said, there was no fresh water on that island.
No,
We drank seawater that was desalted
right.
to plant reverse osmosis.
Well, that and a lot of beer.
And then we bought the shallow with water. You would cook the water and you got finished with about 2 inches of salt, I guess, at the bottom of it.
Yes, sir.
So I know that Midway Island is also a National Wildlife Refuge
Mhm.
as well. Are there any other notable islands that are used for testing or any other Pacific islands that are also wildlife refuges in the same way?
No. The others are in the Marshall Islands, and they're owned by the Marshallese. And I don't know if they are managing any specific islands for that, but their culture dictates that you look out for Mother Nature. That's what looks out for you. So, yes, sir.
I'd like to just share with you experiences I had there in 1986 while I was on the island. We were in the process of building JCADs, so there was a lot of construction going on. The one incident was when the Russian cruiser came by. And he's 7 miles off the shoreline out there in international waters. Made the base commander a little nervy about that Russian cruiser out there when we had bunkers full of chemical weapons stored. And had a unit of MPs there, and they had a little cabin cruiser boat that they had inherited from somebody that abandoned it because they didn't want to repair it. They replaced it, and we mounted a 50 caliber machine gun on it. And
I got a picture of that.
The MP said, we're going to launch it, we're going to go out and chase that cruiser away. And the base commander, after calling Hickam and saying, send some planes over. We just want to let them know that you're making us nervous. And base commander says, no, MPs aren't going out and chasing off that cruiser. And Hickam said, no, we're not going to send fighter jets over and harass that cruiser because we know why they're there. They just came by to see that you're building it because we may vaporize some of theirs when we're done with ours. And they were just checking on status. There was no threat. Anyway, that was the culture of 1986.
The gentleman in the back, you had your hand up earlier.
I was wondering how this disposal unit compared to the one that was in Utah.
They're basically the same. They've got a double incinerator process they used. The first one would go to 2,700 degrees. Then the vapor from that would go in the second chamber that ran at 2,000 degrees. And then out the stack. And so it's basically the same design for each of the ones they made. Yes, ma'am.
How come you don't cover the 437 program?
I'm not familiar with the 437 program.
I had a question. How many people in the room were on the island stationed? Is everybody? Not everybody. Not me. It's interesting.
It's a big classified program now, isn't it?
I'm not familiar with it.
The Air Force program. 1962 to 70.
Are you speaking of the capsule recoveries? Okay.
I
I'm-
just wondered,
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it. I'm sorry.
because it was our launch vehicle that blew up on the pad.
Well. Yes, sir.
One of the more interesting Wildlife area, seems like that every now and then, all the hammerhead sharks in the Pacific would visit Sand Island. And I went out with the Fish and Wildlife guy who was stationed there at the time, and he went walking amongst them. And I was busy with my hat on, the bird was pooping on it. And I thought it was really interesting. And we still don't know why. I don't think they know why.
Yeah.
Whether it's a mating thing or what caused them to show up there, but it was just sharks everywhere.
Well, Fish and Wildlife were very kind to me too. They took me out and we did bird banding, and they taught me how to properly hold a bird so it wouldn't throw up all over me. So, but yeah, they were great people to work with. There were two there when I was there the second time, and both of them were just incredible people. They knew that I cared, and so they, in turn, wanted to show me everything that I could see.
Got one other thing I'd like to mention if I can. When you saw the picture of the chemical weapon disposal plant, you saw what looked like smoke coming out of the stack. That's actually steam. Because after it goes through the incineration process, it goes through a pollution abatement system that they spray brine water we did on the gas stream, which knocked out any heavy metals or particles or any of that stuff. And so that steam that's going up the stack. We had 7 air monitoring machines on that stack that was actually built by Southwest Research out of San Antonio that would monitor that gas stream to make sure that there was no nerve agent, residual nerve agent. Our first run with rockets was M55 rockets, which were GB rockets. We had 77,000 of them that were stored in the Red Hat area. And the Red Hat area was controlled by the military and the military police. They would remove the bursters from inside these rockets, and then they would put them in what they call a sport, which was an overpack for a bunch of rockets. They would bring them to us, and then we would unload them and go through the process of destroying them, draining the agent out of them, and then cooking the metal part of the rocket.
Right.
So once we got through the 77,000 GB rockets, then there were 4 ships that showed up at Johnston Atoll. They came from Germany, and they told us that they were not supposed to transport chemical weapons across the ocean, but they did.
Yep.
77,000 BS rockets
Yep.
they brought. Now,
The entire German inventory.
I worked over 500 entry hours into the toxic atmosphere out there, wearing the suits and stuff. And so I have first-hand knowledge of what this stuff looks like. And it looks like anything from coffee to champagne to tar, it just depends what it was. Now, we also, one other thing that I'll mention is we had mortars or projectiles. We're supposed to run 48 of those through what they call the metal parts furnace after we drained them from the chemical agent. And the EPA said as long as you don't hit a certain level of contamination where you're running them through the metal parts furnace, then you can do the 48. The problem was we could only do 11 at a time. That's why it took so much longer to do this. The government had us go in, which I did this too. We went into the toxic area, we would drain a mortar, and you would stick a piece of stainless steel tubing down into the mortar to see how much residual agent was left in it. Because the stuff was so thick, sometimes like tar. So that would determine how many you could put in the metal part furnace to burn the residual out. It was a very interesting place to work. One of the best places I've ever worked in my life.
That was home to a lot of people.
Yeah. There were 1,300 of us on that island.
Yeah, yeah, at the high point.
Yeah. And Raytheon Services Nevada was a base
Right.
support, and there were about 250 military police there. There were every part of the military service was there too.
Hmm.
It was a great place to work, and they fed you well.
And fascinating people.
Yes.
You sit down and you talk with anyone, and I mean, they had such a diversified background, and were perfectly comfortable in telling you about, you know, where they came from, what they did, and
Just like this gentleman here.
Yep.
He was there before I was. He was there to build the thing. I was there to help finish it.
yeah. I had people that were there before me would frequent some of the different clubs, like the golf club, you know. Yeah, and I thought that they were missing something. So I went to the Polynesian Club, went in, introduced myself, and it was like, you know, I was a brother and everything was great. And so I would stop over periodically from time to time. They'd tell me what was going on and what problems they saw. And, you know, it was a godsend for me. I knew what to go back and have the contractor focus on without divulging how I knew. And one time we were all sitting around under a tree that was outside of the Polynesian Club. And this old gentleman was talking about when he worked in Anahuac, and that this Howley got a kit plane, and he built this kit plane, and the Howley flew it out over the lagoon. And I said, hold on a minute. Why do you have to say it was a Howley? And they all looked embarrassed, and I said, only a Howley would be stupid enough to do that. So when I went over to the last night to tell them I was flying out the next day, and they said, we know. Well, it's that kind of a community, you know. They knew all of the rosters, who's going on and off, and they said, well, we've got a gift for you. And I said, what, you know what? They came out with a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne. And I looked at it and said, I can't accept this. We had strict rules, you know, nothing over $20 in that. And they all looked disappointed. And I said, however, we can share this. Then everybody was happy. So that was just the kind of interactions you had with people. I had meals with the ex-officer for the military police unit periodically, and he would say, I just don't understand. You and the Island Command, you're fraternizing, you know? I just don't understand that. And I said, well, let me explain. In the military, Army, or Navy, you don't want the person under you to be your friend. You want them to do exactly what you tell them to do when you tell them to do it. Otherwise, you get killed. In the Army Air Force and then the Air Force, you had a unit, a group that were responsible, from the enlisted person doing maintenance on that aircraft, all of the ground crew, right on up to the gunners and the pilot and co-pilot, navigators. You were one unit, so you worked together. It wasn't anything like, you're under me and you will go do this. And he came around, and so It is a different philosophy between the new branches of the service and the old traditional ones. Yes, sir.
I just want to share one other story with you if I could. The surveyor on the island has been there forever. If you want to know anything about that island, you go ask the surveyor, okay, it's in the engineering office. So one day, he says, how busy are you, Mike? I said, well, not really. I said, I need you for about a half an hour. Can you help me out? I gotta shoot some elevations. I said, sure. So we walk out this area, and it's about half the size of this room, and it's got a little fence around it with a sign up that says caution. And he says, go stand on each corner of the thing in the center, and I'm going to take elevations. And I said, sure. I go out there and I'm walking around, and he shoots me with the transit. And I said, is that what you want? He said, yeah. So I come out of the area. And I said, how come you needed to survey the height of this pad? And he said, well, this is where the plutonium was scattered from the missile launch. And it was covered up with 3 foot of coral. That's shielding. That 3 foot of shielding has to be surveyed to make sure it hasn't deteriorated. So you're out there verifying that the shielding hasn't deteriorated. I said, thanks a lot. I'm glad it looks like it's 3 foot tall to me. I thought it was, I'd be getting on your case pretty good. But anyway, I was maintaining. So the question is, really after all that long story, how clean is that from the plutonium spills that took place when the rocket blew up on the launch pad? I mean, how do they ever clean that up to actually not to be allow people to get around
It was cleaned up to the point it was below hazardous standards, so it was releasable for public use.
Yeah, that's a little iffy. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
No.
Oh, please feel free to look at some of the exhibits before you go.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming today to the museum. Yeah, please, for Robert. He did bring some really unique artifacts up here, and it was really great to see that many of you had a connection to Johnston Atoll that were here today as well. So thank you so much for your attendance. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Robert.